Good evening. I'm Steve Edwards, and on behalf of the entire team of the Institute of Politics, we are thrilled to welcome you back to the Cloister Cub for tonight's conversation, taking a look at the Trump tax plan. Subtitle of tonight's event is A Boon to the Economy or Fiscal Madness. And I should say that when we planned this event, we thought that the new tax plan might be the most timely topic coming out of the White House until we realized that it actually should have been the FBI, given the news of this late this afternoon. But we'll try to make this relevant and timely nevertheless, and we're delighted to have three outstanding panelists with us to bring us this conversation, in Grover Norquist, Austin Goolsbee, and Noam Scheiber. I'll turn the floor over to Victoria Singh in just a second to formally introduce them, but I wanted to quickly highlight a few upcoming events to put on your calendars, including one that will happen on Thursday at the Quadrangle Club featuring Justin Trudeau's Principal Secretary, Gerald Butts, his top advisor, will join us for a look at the appeal of Prime Minister Trudeau and the state of U.S.-Canadian relations, which is also timely. That'll be Thursday of this week. On Friday the 19th, so a week from this Friday, we're thrilled to welcome U.S. Democratic Senator Kirsten Gillibrand to campus for a conversation with our own David Axelrod. That will take place on Friday afternoon. That will happen at Gordon Parks Arts Hall, which is on the campus of the Lab School here just down the block. So we invite you to sign up for those events on our website, and to find out much more about what's upcoming, you can go to politics.uchicago.edu. A bit of a note about audience questions. Tonight we'll do passed microphones. So if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand. We'll get a microphone over to you as quickly as we possibly can. As always, we ask that you keep your questions short and to the point and get a question. We also want to invite you to turn off or silence your phones at this point. And for those of you who are new to this building, and are looking for a restroom, restrooms are located, if you go out into the lobby, downstairs behind the main entrance, will take you to the lower level where you can find restrooms. So, without housekeeping out of the way, let me introduce Victoria Singh, who's a third year in the college majoring in economics and history. She's worked as an events ambassador. Those are the students who are central to making sure that our events happen and that you are all checked in and situated and our microphones are passed and guests are situated for the last 3 years, and she is hoping to pursue a career in economic policy and tax reform, so we couldn't think of a more fitting student to get us started tonight. Please join me in welcoming Victoria to the podium.
Thank you. Recently, the Trump administration has released a one-page tax plan which can have vast consequences for the United States economy. Today, we have a fantastic panel here to discuss whether President Trump's tax plan is fiscal madness or will make America's economy great again. Grover Norquist is a conservative activist and the founder and president of Americans for Tax Reform, an organization which opposes any and all efforts to increase taxes. Norquist was a key figure in the tax cuts of the Bush administration, and in 2013, he won the comedy fundraiser, Washington's Funniest Celebrity. Austin Goolsbee is the Robert P. Gwynne Professor of Economics at the Booth School of Business. He was the youngest member of President Obama's cabinet, having served as the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. Goolsbee's research focuses on the internet, government policy, the economy, and taxation. Jon Stewart has described him as Edward Ness meets Milton Friedman. Our moderator is Noam Scheiber, a Rhodes Scholar and reporter for the New York Times. He has covered labor and the workforce and has also written for the New Republic and is the author of The Escape Artists, a book on the Obama administration's efforts to save the U.S. economy in the 2008 recession. And with that, please join me in welcoming our amazing panel.
So thanks for being with us. I just want to point out that I think Austin got shortchanged in the introduction. He is also a winner of Washington's Funniest Celebrity. So so it's just a murderer's row up here. I'm not funny, mildly amusing at times, but definitely not funny. So I would, I'm not going to complete the threesome, unfortunately. So let's get right to it. When then candidate Trump would talk about his tax plan on the campaign trail, he would periodically say, it's going to cost me a fortune, which is actually true. He actually said the which is actually true part. But when he released his tax plan, it did not appear as though it were a policy that were going to cost someone like Donald Trump or Donald Trump himself a ton of money. Most of the mainstream analysis, and we could disagree about it as I'm sure we will, but most of the analysis suggests that it was going to redistribute income upwardly. And I think this was, it's safe to say, a major theme of the media coverage of the tax plan when it came out a couple weeks ago. I guess two questions at the outset. One, do you agree with that? Do you agree with the kind of mainstream consensus about the distributional effects? And two, I think the coverage in outlets like my own and other newspapers and television outlets was maybe more so than in a previous era, went out of its way to point this out. So sort of ostensibly objective news outlets in their headlines like ours said, Trump tax plan will reward the wealthiest, things to that effect. Conservatives got very upset by this when certainly by our headline and other headlines in similar outlets. So the second question is, regardless of what you think about the actual distributional effects, is it fair or unfair for mainstream outlets who are ostensibly in the business of just reporting the news to point that out kind of high and in the headline of their pieces? Grover, let's start with you.
Sure. We have a progressive tax structure. If you're going to reduce taxes, it would be, and across the board, a higher income person would have a bigger tax cut. They said this about the Reagan tax cuts as well back in 1981. After they passed, and with the growth that came out of it, it moved the distribution onto the backs of higher income people as they ended up paying more taxes with more growth. So, and a bigger percentage of the budget. Focusing on, I think the key thing here is total size of government, how expensive things are, whether the tax structures get in the way of economic growth or by getting out of the way are helpful to economic growth. I guess I didn't notice that the press was yelling it's all for rich people, because that's what the Democrats do whenever you want to cut taxes. And whenever they raise taxes, they say they'll only raise taxes on rich people. As Obama promised, the central promise of the Obama campaign, the one that was said the most, was that he would never raise taxes on anyone who earned less than $250,000 a year. And they went on to say, not this kind of tax, not that kind of tax, not any kind of tax. That was broken 2 weeks into the campaign, and about 8 of the tax increases in Obamacare directly hit middle-class people. And no, the New York Times didn't spend any time on that. So you get used to that. It's what Democrats say when you try to cut taxes. When they raise taxes, they claim it's only rich people. When they cut taxes, it's only rich people, although the tax hikes they come up with often hit middle-income people.
Awesome.
Well, there are two. You had one small factual question and one value judgment, which I'm probably not. On the factual question, factually, I think it is overwhelmingly the case that the vast, vast majority of the money that this tax plan will cost will be going as tax cuts to high-income people. Now, fairness, what Grover said is true. In a world with progressive taxation and crossed with, I would add, a highly skewed income distribution, it is going to be the case that if you cut all income taxes, you're going to disproportionately benefit high-income people. We probably will or should go through some more detail, because I think it's not just a figment of, well, what did you think was going to happen? It's a progressive tax code. There are particularly egregious, almost unbelievable loopholes that, as of right now, are in the Trump plan, the likes of which we have never seen at the federal level, like the setting the top rate on all pass-through income to 15%, which would open up the mother of all loopholes to very high-income people to basically just get their top tax rate on their income down to 15%. which that's not just a figment of the income distribution or a figment of progressive taxation. That's a design, you would say a flaw, but I think that was a feature. I think it was designed to do the thing that people are afraid of. On the part about the press, I think it probably is not fair. I think the press, to my mind, has a tendency, not so much, Grover's perspective sounded like was they're Democrats and liberals and that's why they say that. I think it's more because the press, and not all the press is like Noam and know the issues as that well or even know what the debate is about. So things like, well, should we cut the corporate income tax rate down to 15%? Should we actually think that would increase the growth rate of the United States, or will that just be a big windfall? And we have a lot of international evidence on that. I get the sense that the typical reporter who's writing about the tax code is not going to engage at that level. They're just like, oh, this is for rich people. That's the main thing about it. So I do think that's basically unfair and not totally accurate.
Well, let's explore the issue you raised that, if we were just cutting, say, marginal rates for individuals, then what Grover says is exactly right? You're going to cut rates, people who make the most pay the most, and if you're cutting across the board, they're going to benefit the most by definition, right? But as Austin says, this is more than that, right? This is not just an across the board cut. It's lowering the corporate rate, lowering cap gains, estate tax. The tax on the Obamacare tax on investment income, the surcharge. If you go across the board, these are some of the most progressive taxes in the tax code and not just lowering rates across the board. What should the kind of average middle class person who sees this accumulation of cuts to the most progressive taxes in the code think this has to offer them?
Well, one of the things that Trump talks about, and I think is important, Reagan talked about it as well, the reason for these tax cuts are not only that you earn the money and there should be a presumption that you keep it unless there's some absolute need that the government has to do something that's mentioned once or twice in the Constitution with your money. But I think we're talking about economic growth. And when you look at the Reagan years from when Reagan's tax cut took effect, January of 1983, the economy was growing at 4%. A year. There was a month when we added 1 million jobs, and 4 million jobs over a 12-month period. Strong economic growth. So the question of who benefits from tax cuts on corporations or rich people, well, I guess the 4 million people who got jobs who didn't have jobs before, who kind of by definition weren't millionaires, were the biggest beneficiaries of the Reagan tax cuts, the jobs created. The challenge during the Obama years, from the bottom of the recession ended and we started to grow again, the growth was more like 2% a year. And that has real effects on job creation and the numbers of jobs. So if we'd grown at Reagan levels under Obama, there'd be 12, 15 million people working today who aren't. That's why people are grumpy. That's how Trump won. People's brothers, people's sisters, people's parents are out of work, because we could have and should have had more growth. And I would argue that Reagan's policies of lower rates plus deregulation, I know we're talking about taxes, but I don't think you can do the one without the other. You can't just cut taxes and not give the guy a permit to build a pipeline. Hey, how come the tax cut didn't get you the pipeline? Because there's no pipeline, because there's no permit. So deregulation and tax reduction, I think, are necessary to free up the economy. And I'm focused more on creating those jobs. I know Trump is from both an economic standpoint, but also 2018 and 2020 will be good years or bad years for the Republicans if he gets the job creation that he expects to get from the lower rates. And so when you say who benefits, the people who get jobs who didn't have them are the biggest beneficiaries.
Austin, just in this vein,
there was a lot going on in that answer, and you lost me at hello, Grover. I don't.
That's okay.
I think I disagree with almost each component of that, both the historical record of what happened when Reagan cut taxes, B, Reagan didn't cut taxes on corporations. That was on individuals. The growth rate that ensued, at least half of that growth rate came from population growth. So the growth in the country is GDP per capita times growth rate of the number of people. The population growth rate was about triple at that time what it is now. We can't wave a magic wand and make the country younger. So that part is not coming back. And I guess let's walk through it in three parts. It is absolutely not true. When Ronald Reagan cut taxes, they pass it in 1981. It goes into effect through 1982 and 1983. Federal tax revenue plunges as a share of GDP. It does not go up. Now, if you ever watched The Simpsons, there was one where a bear came to Springfield and they pay all these taxes to have a bear patrol to stop it. And Ned Flanders says, that's the only bear, that's the first and only time anyone's ever heard of a bear. And Homer's like, no, we need a bear patrol tax. They have stealth bombers, they have the whole thing. So he gets up in the morning and he's like, one big fat paycheck and no bears. The bear patrol must be working like a charm. And Lisa says, that's specious reasoning. And he says, thank you, honey. And she's like, no, I mean, by that reasoning, this rock scares tigers away. And he says, how does it work? She says, it doesn't work. It's just a stupid rock, but I don't see any tigers, do you? And he's like, Lisa, I'd like to buy that rock from you. And this, look, in years, every year, before Ronald Reagan cut taxes, after Ronald Reagan cut taxes, in the year when we had that, how many people here are seniors? Is anybody a senior? Okay, your freshman year, you remember Chicago had a bonfire festival that was to honor the fire, and they were going to have the world's biggest bonfire or something on this barge that they were going to float down Chicago River, but it was raining and they used up all the matches and they couldn't get the fire to start. Okay, since then, tax revenue has soared and we've added more than 6 million jobs. Good thing they didn't get that fire going. Good thing Lisa's got that tiger fighting rock. That is the same logic that says the economy grew and Ronald Reagan's tax cuts generated revenue. No, they didn't, not even close, absolutely not. From the second they passed the tax cuts, in the following year, we went into a deep recession. As a share of GDP, revenue plunged from 19.8% to a little over 17. And do you know when we got back to 19.8% of GDP in tax revenue? 17 years later under Bill Clinton, after they raised taxes again. It's not true that tax cuts pay for themselves. It's not remotely true that anything like the tax cuts Donald Trump is proposing would increase the growth rate even by a small amount. Forget about to 4, 5, and 6% as Donald Trump has promised. All I will ask you to do is look around the world at the evidence, okay? There are many countries that have cut their corporate tax rates. The lowest corporate tax rate in the world, you say, well, maybe we could grow as fast as that country. Who is it? Uzbekistan. What region has the lowest corporate tax rate of all regions in the world? Europe. Could we match the growth rates of Europe by cutting our corporate tax rates to the European rates? Actually, our growth rate has been twice what their rate has been. So I agree with Grover that it is about growth and how do we get growth higher. And we certainly could overtax and overregulate. But I sense a theme that we will get back to. There is a worldview difference of where does growth come from. And there's one worldview that says growth comes from the absence of government. If you would just get the government out of there, then growth will happen. And the other side, and if you believe that side, then I think you have to ask yourself, why is Silicon Valley, for example, in California, which has always been a high tax state, always been a high regulation state since forever? Why is Wall Street in Manhattan? And the answer is They don't go there because it's cheap, because there's no regulation, because there's low taxes. They go there because they can't afford not to go there, because that's where the talent is. And that's where the education system is built up. And that's where the economic infrastructure is strong. And so the other worldview says you have to raise money and make investments in things that are key for growth. And that, I think, is where our tension is, back and forth, where I view cutting financial aid, cutting the NIH budget, cutting science, cutting people off from Obamacare so they can't go start their own companies because they're afraid they're going to lose their insurance. I view that as a huge negative. And I think it's worth paying higher taxes if you're going to use it for that. I agree with Grover, if you're just going to take the money and burn it, that's a stupid idea. But Silicon Valley's not on the island of Vanuatu. And I understand on Vanuatu there's no taxation of any kind. There's a corporate tax rate, nothing, and personal tax rate, nothing. Sometimes I'll say that. I'll be in an audience of hedge fund people or something. They'll come up after. Where is this island of Vanuatu? But just think about that. Before you say, yes, if we cut our corporate tax rate down to the levels in Western Europe, why hasn't it worked for Europe?
Let's continue in this vein, but let me just reshape the debate slightly. And the way I'd like to reshape it is with what may seem like a bit of an esoteric distinction, but I think it's an important one, and that's the distinction between tax cuts and tax reform. And obviously this plan is being sold as tax reform, but it seems to my eyes more like tax cuts. Though I think there are elements that we could call reform that maybe both sides might agree are overdue. But in that vein, what are the kind of elements of the tax code that you could, in a kind of ideologically neutral way, if such a thing is possible, say, you know what, we could raise the same amount of revenue in a more efficient way, in a way that would stimulate greater economic growth, and we're just not doing it because probably politics, right? But are there pieces of this that you guys could agree on in principle that are just like dumb, inefficient pieces of the tax code that don't get us, don't get us where we want to be growth-wise, and the money could be raised more efficiently in other places?
Yeah, possibly. Just here, this is when we did better than Europe, which ended in 2016. We used to do much better. That's been declining, and the European average growth has been ahead of us. So there has been a cost compared to Europe. At the end of the Carter years, people said, limits to growth, there's no more growth, it can't happen. Well, that was Carter, and then Reagan changed that. And we're now hearing from the left, whenever I get into debates, you can't do growth anymore, we don't have more people. Well, what we do have is people who used to be in the workforce leaving the workforce. The labor force participation is right. There are plenty of people in the United States. If Obama's policy had given us growth, there weren't not people between the ages of 25 and 55. There are. They just aren't in the workforce the way they used to be. That's who needs to be back in the workforce.
So let's stick with that. So that's a great, I think that sort of structural question but what is the tax policy lever that would get those people who are out of the workforce back in the workforce? Because I think we'd all agree that we'd like them in the workforce.
If you want to increase per capita wealth, you need to increase productivity. And that means, among other things, you need more investment in capital. And so I would not double and triple tax capital. I would welcome flows of capital from other countries rather than try and chase them away. And capital moves easily to other places. And so when you beat it to death with high tax rates or repetitive tax rates, what I would argue, one second, just when I argue for tax reform, and mostly I'm interested in lower taxes because I think it's the most important reform, but I'd prefer to tax consumed income at one time at one rate. What we do now is we tax income when you earn it, when you save it, when you invest it, when it's in a company, when you get a dividend, when you get a capital gain. If you're stupid enough to die, they want to take half. So they just keep coming back and biting at the same apple, much of those taxes on savings and investment. So efforts like making it easier for people to save for the future, I like that because I hope that people with 401ks and IRAs have more control. I like health savings accounts because that gives people more control over their own health care. So part of it is how do you not double and triple tax savings and investment? And also how do you give people more control over their lives? I was just down in Chile. In Chile, they take 15% of your income and they put it in a 401k or an IRA for you. And Chileans have a great deal of savings. They've had tremendous growth. They do get growth at 6% a year down there. And they both create more savings. And that savings is not controlled like Argentina by the government or by Social Security, our government, but it's in your account that you control that the government can't touch. And that gives people more autonomy.
I mean, there's some things about that that are appealing. We've also found that the research pretty clear that there's a wide swath of the country that either doesn't have access to it through an employer or has changed jobs or whatever to those kind of savings vehicles, or that are woefully under-resourced for their own retirement. They're basically not going to be able to retire because if you're trying to make these choices about your own investment vehicles, the expenses are high, and as anybody from the Booth School, which I know there's some of you there, they will tell you if you have high expense ratios, by the end, decent chunk of your entire retirement savings is going to have gone to the financial providers, not to your own retirement. So there is a dark side to trying to get everyone off of the old pension system and onto saving for themselves. I am kind of sympathetic. If you were going to do a full-blown tax reform, or said differently, if you were going to start from zero, you would not make the tax code what it is. You probably wouldn't even make it an income tax. You'd probably start with some progressive consumption tax or something like that. And it was kind of interesting that when they started the discussion of corporate tax reform, it was to be revenue neutral.
Right.
It was to be paid for. And the argument was, let's broaden the base and lower the rate, and that would be a rational thing to do. And actually, there was bipartisan agreement on that. The problem is, whenever you go to broaden the base, Donald Trump has taken the Oprah line that you get a car, you get a car, you get a car, and you get a car. So there's nobody, he hasn't sold any trade-offs. They haven't portrayed that there will be tax reform. They have portrayed only everybody gets a free gift. So when they said border adjustment or in the healthcare exclusion or in the interest deductibility or any way that you would actually pay for it, a bunch of people howl and protest. Wait a minute. The corporate tax cut will cost around $2.5 trillion. The border adjustment tax would essentially raise taxes on consumers by $2 trillion. Well, consumers are going to notice if you raise the tax on them $2 trillion, and that's why they backed away from it.
But just what is our best estimate about the drag that this kind of you get a car style of tax policy making exerts on the economy? Suppose we were able to lower the rate, the corporate rates dramatically, broaden the base on the individual side.
Questions. Those are two different. One is, what would this Trump change do? And I think that it would be quite modest. And it's not just me. With the IGM does a survey of 37 leading economists across the spectrum, and nobody.
Well, there was one, and then he admitted that he misunderstood the question.
He thought it was a nod, and he thought it was positive. But the second question is, how bad is it that the United States has the highest rate in the world on the books when it collects no higher than average as a share of revenue? In other words, we have the narrowest base and the highest rate, which seems crazy. But all I will say is we, the economists, pushed the system that we have now as being better than the system of broad base, because the argument was cutting the corporate tax rate is a big windfall for a bunch of stuff that's already been built, that you'd be better off incentivizing investment rather than just cutting taxes for existing capital. So we actually have massively favorable investment incentives R&D tax credit, the cost of capital for investment is among the lowest in the world. And so I don't know actually that if you replaced our system, revenue neutral, with one where you took away depreciation allowances and the R&D tax credit and all that stuff and used all that money to cut the corporate rate, I don't even know that it would be positive on growth. It might easily be negative.
Yeah. The discussion of what Trump has put forward and the Republicans in the House and Senate is not in a vacuum. We just went through 8 years where the administration, and when I talked to Senator Kerry, who is managing the administration's campaign to get a tax increase as part of the budget deal in 2011, he came up to me and said, Grover, I need your help talking to the Republicans. Oh, you know, your wife and my wife, they should have tea. Yes, they should. What do you want? And he said, well, all we need is a $1.4 trillion net tax increase. And I said, I thought we were looking for a $1.2 trillion fix, the second half of the budget deal that was to cut roughly $2.5 trillion in spending. Obama kept hearing deficit, Republicans kept saying spending, and he kept thinking that a tax increase was the equivalent of spending restraint, which it wasn't, but that was Kerry was taking that position. The tax reform he wanted was a $1.4 trillion net tax increase. When they tried to do revenue neutral corporate side, they kept being given by the White House the requirement that it raise a great deal of money. And so we're not looking at this, wouldn't it be interesting to have some revenue neutral tax reform? That's never been on the table. They wanted a massive tax increase. We're going to get a tax cut. The two parties have two different positions. Part of it is driven by spending issues. I know we're talking about taxes, but the reason you tax is so you can spend the money. Something George Herbert Walker Bush missed when the Democrats said, if you raise taxes, we'll cut spending. He raised taxes in 1990 and spending increased not only above what they promised it would, but more than they had said they were going to before the tax increase. Tax increases are what you do instead of governing. The pledge that I share with elected officials is a pledge to the American people, not as Obama and Harry Reid sometimes say to me personally. It's a pledge to the American people. I will vote against any effort to net raise taxes. Not eliminate taxes, not even cut taxes, just they're not going up. That requires then that you focus on spending restraint. And that's what happened when the Republicans refused to raise taxes in 2011 as Obama wanted. We got $2.2 trillion in spending restraint, and you got the actual sequester, which limited total spending and brought spending down from 24 almost to 20% of GDP. It's a tremendous drop in the cost of government. The cost of government is not taxes. The cost of government, the deadweight cost of government, is spending. If the government spends $1, it's gone. It doesn't matter if they tax 90% and borrow 10, or tax the whole dollar, it's gone. Raising taxes so that you don't have to borrow 10 cents does not free up resources for the economy. It just means you took it rather than took most of it and borrowed some of it. So focus on tax increase, on tax issues, also on spending issues. And if you believe that everything's spent wisely and there's no reform that could fix things, well then I guess you have to raise tax, and you want to do everything that's being done, then you have to raise taxes. But if you recognize that there's a great deal of spending that's unnecessary and counterproductive, then saying no to tax increases is step one to getting those reforms in spending. And we've had some success at that, but only in those states where we took taxes off the table, only at those times where in the national level we've taken taxes off the table. Then you have a chance of a discussion of reforming government. But tax increases are what you get instead of reformed government.
And all I would say to that is, number one, you know the population is aging. Okay, so do nothing. Keep everything the same as it is as a share of the economy. Government spending will rise dramatically because more people are going to retire and get Social Security. They're going to get Medicare. They're evidently not going to get Medicaid, but Social Security and Medicare are going to go up. So if you say taxes will never rise. You are trying to repeal the aging of the population. If you insist that the spending stay at the level it was as a share of GDP under Ronald Reagan, you're again saying, okay, either we're going to wave a magic wand and abolish aging, or else we're going to go squeeze every discretionary part of the government, which includes all the education and all the science and all the stuff that I like, and then we'll see, does that help growth or does that hurt it? And I think it hurts it, and it sounds like Grover thinks it would help it, but I think that's the context.
Well, let me just, we have a couple minutes before we start taking some questions. Let me get this guy named Donald Trump back into this conversation, because I think he's an interesting character in all this. I was struck when I read up on basically everything that Grover had said about the Trump tax plan going back to the campaign and everything Austin had said. And you guys had strangely used a very similar term, but you used it in very different ways. So let me read you what Austin actually said this on The Daily Show recently, a couple weeks ago, and Grover wrote it, or said it, I think, during the campaign. But so Austin said, look at the philosophy behind what Trump is proposing. It is not a grown-up conversation about entitlements, costs. It's nonsense. He promises never to cut Social Security and Medicare. He promises to have $2 trillion of tax cuts, abolish the debt, but he can't figure out how to do it. That's what you refer to as not a grown-up conversation.
Yes.
Grover used the same word grown-up, but in a very different way. He said, this is about the Trump tax plan. When he can't pronounce foreign leaders' names, it leads you to believe that he might not release a serious tax plan. But this is a sophisticated, grown-up tax plan. Could you guys just define?
We only have a difference in the adults in our lives.
Yeah.
You know, what do we think of the
let's
grown-ups?
just, I mean, I would like, before we take questions, if you guys could each riff on Trump himself as a policy maker, because essentially the president is the chief policymaker, and how that intersects with the tax plan we are likely to get as a result of his own policy interests, policy preferences, ideology, such as it is.
First, the president's not the chief policymaker, Congress is. The president gets to pretend to be, to direct the orchestra plays what it wants to. The president gets to veto stuff, but that is not a very strong political weapon. I like the Trump tax plan. I think it's very pro-growth. I think it will force conversations about spending restraint. I think his budget moves in that direction. I would recommend to you Paul Ryan's Roadmap to Prosperity, which deals with reforming all of the entitlement programs. The president said he won't touch Social Security, which isn't a very big thing to say because that requires 60 votes by law. The rest of it can be reformed with 50 votes in the vice president. But to say that Social Security is off the table is simply to say you don't have 60 votes. And yes, we do need to reform entitlements. Alice Rifkin actually wrote a very good plan on Medicare reform, which solves many of the problems. It doesn't bankrupt us because people get older. We don't have to get older. Immigration is very important, and letting people, the 25 to 55-year-olds who have absented themselves from the workforce because of the way the economy's been run, can come back into the workforce. Plus, there's nothing wrong with people who are 65 years old. A lot of people would like to have jobs if they were available. Not everybody wants to retire at the same age. So for all those things, I think Trump's position, look, he talks to business guys all the time, and he has a sense of what gets in the way of economic growth. Why? And this gets to the regulatory stuff, because that's the stopper. If you don't get a permit, you don't have a building. If you don't get a permit, you don't get a refinery. If you don't have a permit, you don't get a pipeline. I mean, we're now finishing pipelines that were denied and delayed permits for years in this war on infrastructure for the last 8 years that's finally coming to an end. That's a very important part of creating jobs. Lower taxes is part of it. But I get worried a little bit on some of his rhetoric on the free trade issue, because I'm not sure he understands that tariffs are just taxes, and they're taxes on the American people. Foreigners do not pay tariffs. American consumers pay tariffs. In France, they have stupid tariffs in France. French people pay the stupid tariffs in France. Americans pay stupid tariffs here. And we have a very long, good history of American opposition, support for free trade and opposition to tariffs. South Carolina in 1830, 32, they called out the National Guard because there was a tariff passed in Washington. Washington backed down. And so there was a level of understanding. There was a national convention called up in Massachusetts to fight the tariffs because people recognized that those were taxes that were problematic. So sometimes when Trump talks about, he hasn't jumped over the edge on NAFTA or some of these other things. I worry about that. But on taxes and regulations and spending, he has a very serious conversation. And the direction he wants to head in is one that I think is good for the country. It looks like the Reagan plan. It's the opposite of Obama and Carter plan. So they're different. And right and left people are going to disagree on whether this is the right program. That's what elections are for.
So Austin, I mean, same question, but you work closely with the president. I mean, does it matter if the president is not sort of fluent?
Look, I think it matters.
Yeah.
I shouldn't, Grover, it sounds like knows President Trump. I've never met President Trump. I tell the story about health care. You might have heard me say it before, that I think that they've sown the very problems that they're having are absolutely sown by Trump, the candidate, and by the campaign that he ran, because normally the campaign is at least fundamentally about some ideas, and you fleshed out a bit what you want to do. And in the healthcare space, my friend Sean Hannity, who is sympathetic to Donald Trump, had Donald Trump on his show, and he said, Donald, people are criticizing you for not having specifics. So you say you want to repeal and replace Obamacare. What would you replace it with specifically? And Donald Trump said, something fabulous. And that was it. That was his plan, something fabulous. And if you say my plan is something fabulous, a fabulous tax plan, a fabulous health plan, then it comes to transition. You appoint business people with no policy experience. I thought what that meant was kind of like what Grover said of he's delegating that to Congress. You guys figure out the details. But if you do that, then you have to give your own people cover when they start coming up with details. And Donald Trump has not been willing to do that. So when they said, well, we'll pay for this with border adjustment tax, Donald Trump tweets out, I don't like this whole border adjustment thing. If they say things about the health plan that are unpopular, Trump will say, well, I'm not for that one. And that leads Congress to then back up and say, well, then you do it. I mean, we're not going to stick our neck out. I think fundamentally the president not having the slightest clue about policy is deeply dangerous. And it keeps me up at night. I mean, yes, maybe they'll just pass a tax cut and we'll lose $2.5 trillion, but that won't blow up the world. George W. Bush basically did the same thing, half the size. It didn't help growth. It massively increased the deficit, but it didn't destroy the world. If they pile that on top of tariffs and let's start some trade wars and let's stop immigration to the country so that our aging problem gets worse, and let's go threaten, to get in a shooting war in multiple places around the world, I think it could be really bad. And that's the type of thing that happens if you don't know the details.
But if I could differ on that, he doesn't micromanage, this is true.
I agree with that.
However, I mean, I like the Supreme Court judge they came up with. Seems like a fine fellow. But I think more important is his choice as chairman of the FCC, Federal Communications Commission. That's 16% of the economy, and they've been turning it into a public utility. And that we have 8 years of stupid and 8 years of evil, and he's going to undo 16 years of regulatory morass in the next 2 years with his appointment of Ajit Pai. Today, the Senate just approved a new FDA chair who has an approach that I think will lead to a great deal more investment in research and development of drugs, not necessarily government investment, but private investment. And this is a very important step forward. If you vape, if you've ever tried to quit smoking cigarettes, this new guy is going to save your life, and the other guy was going to have Al Capone prohibition on vaping, so you can be stuck with cigarettes. These are life and death decisions as well as economic ones. and the FTC. I mean, these are dramatic movements towards deregulatory regimes with very smart people that somehow he managed to come up with. And I think if you look at the list of guys that he's delegated to, that he's hired, it's fairly impressive.
Maybe not the National
grown up.
Security Advisor initially, but you know,
Oh, I
some
thought
of
he
the
very
others.
cleverly moved him out. He said, okay, gone.
Look,
but the guy,
and those
the
are
guy he's got
independent
now is pretty good.
agencies. These are, as you might imagine, those views are controversial. At the FCC, do you think that neutrality is horrible, evil? What was your summary?
No, stupid was the Bush 8 years.
Stupid, evil.
Evil was later.
And so those are controversial, but each of these are independent agencies. Okay, the FDA has a task, has a function. You can disagree on what should be the approach of the FDA. You can put somebody in. The budget, taxes, things like that. There's no independent agency that does that, and those are the areas. And likewise in foreign policy and domestic taxes and budget. Those are things where the president having no clue is a major disadvantage to the operation of the government.
All right, let's go to questions. We have 2 people circulating with mics who will hook you up.
Hi, my name is Steve. I'm working here at college. My question is, so recently, in like 10 years or so, we might have driverless cars, and 4 million people might lose their jobs because of it.
We might have what? It's hard to hear.
So in 10 years or so, we might have a driverless car.
Driverless car.
A driverless car. Okay.
4 million people might lose their
Yeah.
jobs because of it. How do you think tax policy might change in a world where basically, people might not have work in the future, or basically machines will replace a lot of the current jobs that people work in?
Yeah, we have been through this before. We used to have, in the United States, 90% of Americans worked on farms, then it went down to 70 and 50, and for a long time, we had a rather large percentage of the economy in agriculture. We now have maybe 1 or 2% of the population in agriculture. We create more food with 1 or 2% than we ever did, and export more than we ever did with 70 and 90%. Manufacturing, people have talked about, isn't it bad that these manufacturing jobs, there are fewer of? We have more manufacturing goods being produced with a smaller percentage of the population working on it. It's not that we're out of manufacturing, it's that we're not manufacturing with as many people. I think we could do more manufacturing if we had better tax policy and we took all the trial lawyers and put them in plastic bags and flowed them down the river. But on the question of manufacturing jobs, Mark Penn, Democratic pollster for Hillary and company, told me of one of the polls he did recently. I think it's Harris and Harvard, or Harvard and Harris poll. To adults, do you want your children to work in manufacturing? 6% yes. So it's not what, for the long time people said, oh, wasn't it wonderful to be on the farm? This is everybody whose grandparents left the farm. And now everybody wants their children working in manufacturing. It thinks somebody else's children should go work in manufacturing. There has been, over time, a change in the economy, and if the economy is growing, we can absorb workers. You're saying 4 million people. He's saying we're not got enough workers. Well, if you change people out from some jobs and make other jobs available, and you have flexible training, and we have educational choice, so people can decide what kind of education is best for them, I think we're in much better position. I think a flexible economy does very well with change. A static economy does very poorly even with slow change.
I think that sounds right to me. Certainly that's the historic lesson. It kind of depends how fast this happens. If the robots took 40% of the jobs in a 5-year period, then we would have major indigestion in the economy creating new jobs. But the thing to remember is every month the jobs numbers come out, and they average like 175, 200,000 a month. That's a net number, okay? So every month the economy loses something like 4.5 million jobs and adds 5 million jobs, for a net of plus 500,000, let's say. And I just find it hard to look at the gross flows of how many jobs are getting created all the time and think that this issue is going to be too horribly traumatic unless we blow this part about skills, education, flexibility. If we mess that up so that the only jobs people can get pay way dramatically less than the jobs they used to have, then I think this transition is going to be much worse.
They're beginning to look. Republicans and Democrats are beginning to look at what the Swiss and the Germans have done with apprenticeships. We have a bunch of laws that make that difficult or impossible. We have to change state laws that lack the flexibility. If you're 14, you can go to school and not get paid, but you can't go to school and be an apprentice and do something productive and get paid while you're at school, because that's child labor. And there's a series of laws like that the Swiss would like to come in and set up training programs for people in banking and the pharmaceutical industry, and they're running up against state and local laws that make it impossible for them to replicate what's worked in Germany, what's worked in Switzerland. We need more flexibility, and if I'm a critic sometimes of what our wonderful government does to help us, is that they set up some rule and then they'll come back 100 years later to revisit the rule and see how it's doing. And the world moves faster than that. There's that wonderful quote from the CEO who said, technology moves 10 times faster than the business leaders, and the business leaders work 10 times faster than government, and government sets the rules by which we guide technology. And that doesn't work. They keep running into the bridge abutment.
Hello, my name is Mason, and I am an alum of the college. And I want to ask a question that hopefully both Mr. Norquist and Mr. Goolsbee can talk to, which is the effort to repatriate corporate profits overseas. Something that Trump has talked about, and something that he would like to do, that Obama tried to do, that Bush tried to do. But why? So I guess the one part of the question is,
Obama didn't try to do that, and I'll explain why he was against it.
Well, I guess the sort of two parts of the question are, like, why is that something that's so difficult to incorporate into a tax plan, and how, or do you think Trump will, or do you think it's something that he should do in a tax plan? I hope both can speak to that.
Can I go first?
Sure, I can go first. Trump has proposed that. Okay, so how the U.S. tax system works is the U.S. rate is 35%. I'm going to give you the 10,000 foot level. 35%. If you go to a place where the tax rate is 15%, when you bring the money back to the U.S., we tax on a worldwide basis. So we say, you paid 15, you owe us 20 to get to the U.S. rate of 35%. That led a bunch of companies to go to tax havens or whatever. They've got this money. They don't want to bring it back because they will have to pay taxes on it if they bring it back. So there's one school of thought that says, why don't we set a very low tax rate, 5%, maybe 10%, and try to get them to bring that money back to the U.S. Now, they did that with that exact logic in 2004. And they made those companies sign a piece of paper that said, I will use this money to create jobs in the United States. The economists that then go back and look at what happened show that 92% of the money that came back was paid out in dividends. It was not used for the net expansion of capital. And that's because, so in this, if you say, why would you not want to just lower the tax rate and bring the money back? Isn't that free money? It's not free money. About $50 billion a year gets repatriated anyway. The companies say, we want the money in the US, so they pay the taxes and they bring it back. So you will lose that. Then, number two, the whole premise of why does it make sense is premised on, if only the cost of capital were low enough. The thing that's keeping these companies from investing in the US is that there's money overseas that it's too expensive to bring it back. There's about $2.5 trillion on the balance sheet of corporations in the United States that's not being used. A little over half of that is outside the US. The other half is already sitting in their bank accounts in the US, not being used. So you can give a huge tax cut and get them to bring that money back to the US. But then all you will do is create people saying, why is there now $2 trillion sitting in banks being unused in the United States? The reason why I think you've seen this happen across the world, not just in the United States, of companies returning to profitability, but then just sitting on the money, is because they went through a financial crisis in which if you didn't have liquid assets, you died. And so now there's just a lot bigger buffer that all companies want to have before they do that. And so there's not only no evidence that they will use the money for investment, there's direct evidence from the last time we did this that they will use the money to just pay out dividends, that I don't think it's worth giving that away, that $50 billion a year of repatriation. I just think you'd be better off cutting corporate taxes in some other way rather than rewarding it that way.
Well, the argument for going to a territorial tax system rather than the worldwide tax system that we have and not that many other countries have is that you should tax what happens inside your borders, not tax what happens outside your borders. And when American companies make money overseas, if they want to bring it back, the answer is yes. I don't want you leaving all that money over there for foreigners to touch and stuff like that. Bring it back here. And why in the world insist on some VIG for people to bring money back that they've earned and already paid taxes on? The other challenge, however, is for international companies. These are not, you heard about companies that end up, the Burger King got bought by a Canadian firm, okay? Canada, not normally thought of as some tax haven, but their corporate rate's lower than us and than ours, and they have a territorial tax system so that when Burger King earns money in the United States and around the world and you bring it back to Canada, they don't tax it. Burger King was worth more owned by a Canadian than by an American company. And that's because of our stupid laws. It's not some dirty trick the Canadians picked up. A number of American companies were bought by overseas firms for just the same reason. Things worth more under German law or Belgian law or hell South African law than under American law. And so this tax policy, you talk to the pharmaceutical companies that are still here and they say, there will be no pharmaceutical companies because we're worldwide. There will be none based in the United States in 6 years if Hillary won and you never got territoriality or repatriation. So it has very serious effects. I think it's very important. I think it's very grown up of the president to say, let's get rid of this. All of the guys around him, the New York guys, want to go to a territorial tax system. They've agreed to do this one-time hit of 8% or some number like that, where they go out and deem that you repatriated money that you didn't, just to steal some of it. And then after that, you can bring it back without paying your VIG. And that challenge, I think that's dumb, but the corporate guys say, look, if it's one time and after that we're territorial, we'll do that. And this is what that meeting with all the high-tech guys and Trump said. This is important to Microsoft and Apple and Google and all those guys. They're, borrowing money in the United States to pay dividends while they've got the cash overseas. And while they wait for somebody to do something about territoriality, taking the rate down is kind of low enough. It's kind of the equivalent of territoriality, but it's not everything you need. Ireland has a 12.5% rate. They have worldwide, but it doesn't matter unless you're investing in Saudi Arabia.
Here's my question to you. The corporate guys in New York and other places say, we want an internationally comparable / competitive tax system. And so that's their argument. They say the other guys have territorial, we should have territorial. And the critique that, but then if you go to some tax haven and you save all your taxes, there's no penalty. They say, look, you got to be internationally competitive. And I am sympathetic to that. But I would observe none of those people want the U.S. tax system, the rest of the tax system, to look anything like what are in those countries. Okay, so this is the same thing as that we talked about at the beginning of the U.S. corporate rate is the highest on the books. There's no weird thing about German law that makes them want to move the headquarters. It's just that the corporate tax rate is lower in Germany. How does Europe have low corporate tax rates? By having super high personal tax rates and by having 20+% VATs on European consumers. So the same people saying we need to have the corporate tax rates that they have in Ireland emphatically do not want the income tax rates they have in Ireland and do not want the VATs that they have in Ireland. They just want this one part to be lower.
But also territoriality. I mean, it's not just the rate; it's the rate and worldwide.
Okay,
what's
but
killing us is
would you be willing to cut the corporate rate, shift to territorial, raise the top marginal rate to 50+%, and have a 20% VAT? Because that's how Europe was able to afford cutting those corporate rates.
I'm not interested in being Europe. We fought several wars, and all my relatives left that place, and they told me it sucked. They said they ran out of potatoes, we're out of here. So I never got this weepy thing about the old country. They didn't seem to have enough to eat. But we don't want the European structures, but in this one case, both territoriality and rates, it puts us at a competitive disadvantage worldwide, not just with Europe, but with the rest of the world. We should have lower rates, and again, marginal tax rates are what people make decisions on, not average tax rates. It matters what the next decision you're making. What do you do? What's the tax rate on the final dollar and what you're doing, not the average. Averages are uninteresting. You can drown crossing rivers with an average depth of 2 feet. Averages are less interesting than marginal for decision-making purposes. But I think we're in fine shape to move forward with dramatically lower taxes. And we haven't gotten discussions of spending restraint, but there's an awful lot of reforms we need to do, particularly if we're going to do infrastructure, because so much has been set up to make infrastructure more expensive than it needs to be in the United States, whether it's pipes or roads. We have a series of laws that were passed dozens and dozens of years ago that some of them were just evil, but others were as smart as you could get in 1930 when you set certain regulations there, and we can do better than that now.
Let's take another question to you.
So I wanted to touch on one point, Mr. Norquist, that you made about, having this tax reform to help 25 to 35-year-olds. And one of the things I can't really wrap my head around, and I'd love for you to explain, is for a certain subset of individuals, especially college grads and graduate school grads, the tax cuts, or the tax reform actually increases our tax rate to 33%, 28%. And I'm just kind of curious how, with student debt being a huge problem facing our country, as well as higher, tax rates for us, how does that then help us as far as, it really decreases our spending power and our ability to actually choose to do things like, say, get more education or more training, etc.
How do we increase tax rates on who?
So for the population of individuals, I believe, making $90,000 and above, it increases our tax rate, either stays the same at 25%, or increases people from making, I believe, $112 and above to about 33% rather than 28%.
There are 7 rates right now. Trump is talking about going to 35, 25, and 12. The Republicans in the House were at 33, 25, and 12. The Republicans set numbers as to where these were kicking in. Trump's people, I don't believe, have done that. The way it was designed on the House side was that everybody got a lower marginal tax rate than before. So I don't understand how anybody would be a higher one. If there's some glitch there, I'll talk to people, because it's designed to have lower rates for everybody.
I don't know your family situation, but head of household is a designation for single parents. The Trump plan would abolish the head of household filing status, so there would be a whole bunch of single parents whose tax rates would go up. Now, they
rates
might
would
go
go
back
up,
and
or they get a different exemption?
The brackets are wider for head of household. So if you're a single person, the kid, now you'd be head of household, you'd have a low rate. If they got rid of head of household, you'd have to file as single, so you would move up in
Single
a higher
rather than
bracket
head of
for-
household?
Yeah, so they might
Okay.
change that. I think
I'd
Grover's
be
right.
surprised if that
hasn't-
survives.
Trump hasn't
Yeah.
given the exact specifics.
Yeah.
And a part of it is so that he can say, that's not my plan. You said that's my plan. That's not my plan. But the thing is, with this pass-through loophole, anybody who classifies their personal income as coming from a business will get a maximum rate of 15%. And that counts as profit, so they don't even pay payroll taxes on that. So literally a billionaire will have a 15% tax rate. If you're a single person making $38,000 a year, you will pay the 25% marginal tax rate plus your half of the payroll tax. So you're going to be 33+%. That doesn't make sense to me. Now that's just a moral judgment. Somebody might say, no, but those people are really efficient, and if we give them more money, it'll help us all. I just think that's weird. That doesn't work for me.
I don't think you're going to have to worry about this. When Mnuchin's been walking through this with various groups, he's made it very clear that they're not going to allow people to move wage income or other income. It has to actually be business income. A lot of people start small businesses, pizzeria or something, inside their individual income tax. It's the business income that would be at 15%. Mnuchin keeps going, makes it very clear they're not going to allow people to turn wage income into this, and that they'll have probably more regulations than anyone wants to look at on that front. I wouldn't mind having everybody at 15%. When they put the income tax in, top rate was 7%. When we went to war with Britain, we were paying between 1% and 2% a year, total taxes, federal, state, local. They were thinking about 3%. We started shooting at the British. They were paying 20%. If you want to run an empire, it's expensive. In London, they were paying 20% of their income to the government. The colonists, the occupied territories here, were paying 1% to 2%, and we thought that anything beyond that was ridiculous. I still think it's vaguely ridiculous, but we can aim towards 1% to 2%. I'm willing to take some time getting there.
Social Security benefits weren't as generous back then, though.
Yeah.
Social Security
tuition
benefits give you a
Right.
negative
College
rate of
tuition,
return right now, so generous is
Didn't
not
have
the
Medicare
word
Part D.
for your Social Security.
All right, let's take one last question.
Hi, I'm Kevin, first-year MBA student here. Prior to Wilson, we had no income tax. We survived for 135 years. Income tax was implemented to pay for World War I. We're out of World War I. How do we manage to pay for our government services prior to Wilson?
Well, we had way dramatically fewer government services, and our standard of living was 1/10 or less than what it is now. So I think you got to be a little careful with.
Big government made us rich.
I don't. It's not that it made us rich, though. As I told you, us going to college and us investing in science and us building out infrastructure did help make us rich. Yes, but when wages, the median income is $40,000, $50,000 a year now. I bet it was $3,000 then, maybe less. So I think if you have no Social Security, you have no Medicare, you have no science, you have very little discretionary spending. That's how we did it. And before that, we funded the entire federal government off of tariffs.
No aircraft carriers.
The whole fight of federal government was about increasing and decreasing tariff rates, because that was really the only source of revenue.
A fair amount of the country ran, but 10% was selling land. So we sold a bunch of land. We could do a lot more of that. There's trillions of dollars
Please
worth of land.
Please don't sell the national parks. Please don't.
Okay.
Please don't.
Right. Nobody's talking about the national parks, but
The
if
national monuments, they are.
Yeah, you've ever been to these national monuments?
Yes, I've been to many of them.
Okay. People in Illinois which has 1 or 2% federal land, love to laugh at people in Utah and Idaho and screw them and say, we consider you our backyards, and as imperialists, we like to come and visit the pretty stuff, but you can't actually do anything with your land or have jobs so that your kids can stay in Colorado and stay in Utah and stay in Montana. Have you ever looked at the map of how much of federal land past North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and whatever under those over, you'll see it's massively government run, and there's no reason for it. It's not like New York is hostile to environment or Illinois is hostile to the environment, nor would people in Colorado be. That's a fiction that people in the East use to
We could
pick on
strip
people
mine
in the West.
Yosemite to make granite for our countertops,
Okay.
but I think we would be poorer to
Okay,
do so.
it's a nice try, but take the national parks off and take a look at the rest of it. National parks are a teeny part of it, and not what we're talking about. Also offshore drilling for oil and natural gas and for minerals underwater, which we do in the entire world. But to get to your point, we had taxes on liquor, and one of the reasons they wanted the income tax was so that they could do prohibition. So the income tax allowed prohibition to take place and give us all of the problems from that. Without the income tax, the United States would never have jumped into World War I with both feet, with all the hundreds of thousands of troops we sent over there, with more than 100,000 Americans killed, which then ended the war with the way the world was broken and guaranteed a second war. So the income tax has a lot of blood on its hands, starting with Prohibition and World War I and the problems from World War I screwing up. I'm not a fan of the income tax coming in. I think it was destructive and has been very unhelpful to the economy's growth.
All right. All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen. It's been illuminating, entertaining.
And thank you, everyone, for coming out this evening. Round of applause for our guests.
Right.